So without further ado, since, we only have a 50-minute class, I wanted to go ahead and jump right into it. So I want to introduce everybody to Jabar Boykin. He is a dear friend of mine and an esteemed colleague. He is a YouTuber, a lecturer, a poet, and an activist from Greensboro, North Carolina. He's an alum. He got his MFA here at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. His poetry has appeared in the Freshwater Review and his new chapbook, which comes out on the 15th or the 19th? 15th, 19th, 15?
I'm muted, my bad. Yeah, it comes
Okay.
out on the 15th.
On the 15th, awesome. So in just a few days, whatever happened to Black Boys was recently published by the Texas Review Press. So that's a pretty notable press, everybody. When he is not writing poetry or mentoring students, which he's phenomenal at, he spends his time in front of the camera. He's always reviewing just social events, movies, books, all sorts of stuff on YouTube. I dropped those links for you guys, so definitely check them out, follow them, give them some love. And just going forward for this is kind of like a community conversation. When it comes time to ask questions or anything, you feel free to unmute your mic and talk with us. So any questions? All right, well, I guess I'll turn it over to you, Jabar. Thank you for coming and speaking with us this morning.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I guess I was going to start with a few poems, as we get started. So one thing I started, so my chapbook is, of course, the chapbooks are usually smaller versions of larger books that poets are working on. So this chapbook, Whatever Happened to Black Boys, really came from like a bigger piece that I'm working on. I'm working on actually poems that sort of revolve around the kissing case that happened in North Carolina, where two Black boys, 8 and 9, they were convicted and arrested and put in prison back in 1958 for kissing the white girl. I guess they were playing a game, children's game. The parents found out about it. Of course, it's during time of segregation. And so they ended up, I guess, the parents of the white child ended up going to the police, and then they ended up getting arrested. And so my book sort of surrounds that. It's the full book sort of surrounds that topic mainly, but I did have these other poems in that book that sort of deal with other Black boys, past and present, and that's how this book came about out of that larger piece that I'm working on. And so I'll actually start by reading the two poems I think I sent you guys. I think it is Whatever Happened to My Father and also my poem Mud. Actually, Whatever Happened to My Father is actually the first poem in the book, and then Mud is actually the last poem in this book. And Here's What Happened to My Father actually came about because I have these moments where I just become very interested in a certain topic. So I became very interested in fairy tales, and how we are told traditionally white fairy tales, and turning those fairy tales and making them Black centered. I became very interested in that, and that sort of deviated into me wanting to learn more Black folk tales as well. Which I do have a couple of poems that are like revolve around like Boo Hag and like Andy Christmas and John Henry and stuff like that, and hoodoo. But this one, I don't know, I'll ask you at the end if you can guess what the fairy tale is. You probably already kind of know. So here's the first poem. Here's What Happened to My Father. Beautiful Black boys can't help but be consumed by beasts is how Mama started the story. She said that on his way home from a week's work out of town, picking cotton and cutting tobacco, he grew tired from travel and sought rest from strangers in Mitchell County. Everywhere he went, white palms turned outward, turned him away, until he came across an old abandoned plantation house, where inside he found purses, padded chairs, lampshades, leather shoes, velvet curtains, grandfather clocks, hand-knotted rugs, all fashioned from the skin of former slaves. They spoke to him, whispered warnings of a blue-eyed monster that cursed them to an eternity as inanimate objects. But my father wouldn't listen. His curiosity sent him looking for the monster, and he found her standing in the middle of a parlor room, staring at a cotton stem trapped inside a glass case. Blonde fur covered her body, her face resembling a bobcat. ears pointed with black eyelash accenting the tips, long white wispy whiskers falling on either side of her snout, and a fluffy beard that fell under either side of her chin. Her stature was human-like, and she pleasantly filled out a dress that matched the color of her eyes. He found her remarkable, but when he extended his tongue to let her know she could only give him what beasts are allowed to give, her teeth. A few months later, I saw him at a service station in town. Turns out he just didn't know how to be a father. Can anybody guess what the story is from? Yeah, Beauty and the Beast. Yeah. And so I was really interested in like changing the beauty into his father. So so that story is about actually one of the boys, him talking about his dad and how his dad wasn't there. But I sort of just made it more magical in a sense. And I took the fairy tale and added it to his story and sort of changed it a little bit. Because I always think of myself, even though I'm telling sort of history, I'm not really a historian. That's not really my job to like verbatim like record, but it is to like sort of reimagine and reconstruct stories from the past, from my past experiences. That's really what I'm interested in. And so yeah, I decided to reconstruct that story and to make it into a Beauty and the Beast story. And the last poem of the book, Mud. This poem actually came about because there are a lot of conversations happening online. Um, it was like a lot of respectability politics. I don't know if people know what that is. Respectability politics, like if you act a certain way, then you'll get treated a certain way, and that's just not always true, especially for Black people. Like just because you know, wear a suit and you know do follow the rules doesn't mean that people are going to treat you the way you're supposed to be treated. You know, I always use the example, you know, I guess people think that, you know, if you dress up in a suit or you talk nice and you're well educated, that somehow that means that you are going to be more deserving of respect and you're going to get that respect. And that's just not how that works. You know, I always use the example that Martin, you know, being a Christian, being a devout Christian, you know, being a wholesome man, dressing up in his Sunday best didn't save him. You know, it didn't save him. And so I really try to, there's been a lot of conversations about respectability politics and how much they really fail Black people and how we shouldn't really fall into them. That, you know, oh, Black people act this way, that's why you get shot by the police. That's like, you know, no, like that didn't save Martin, that didn't save Malcolm. They dressed up nice, they talk well, they were well educated, it didn't matter. And so this poem really came from those discussions, from me hearing those discussions online, from frustration really. But it's called Mud. Mud. You can't talk about a plant without the soil. You can't mention Black folks without the mud. Toe roots trapped between brown glue, but somehow we still manage to electric slide our way through the drum of thunder. When it rains, it's poison. My aunts, still kids at heart, two-step their way out of a downpour of droplets. Their locks once killed at the root. Our scalps have always needed protection from the rain, from the sun, the clouds, and the sky in this country. No weather has ever been good weather for us. So my cousin keeps a hat on his head, but every time he steps inside my grandmother's house, she slaps it off, frightens his curls that grow easier in the dark. To her, only those that wish to hide their thoughts from God cover their domes. He doesn't trust God, though. He lives with what crawls in the mud. He remembers when God told a man to name every living thing that creeps and crawls on the earth, and he named himself White, my cousin Black, and the cylinders that squirm between his toes, Polydora ligni. Even the mudworm has a better second name than Black people. But we tried to make it beautiful, replaced the ER with A, took the growl out of the G, changed our inflection, paired it with a hug and a handshake, put it in our music, hung it round our necks in gold, grilled it to our teeth in diamonds, made it spin on our rims, hummed it during sex, greased our scalps with it. But my grandmother doesn't get it. Why don't he have some self-respect? Why don't he get a job? Why he act the way he act? See, this is why they don't like us. She forgets they threw her in the mud when she flat ironed her hair, wore dresses below the knee, read her Bible, gave up her seat on the bus, and went round back to order food. Ever since she was born, She's been trying to turn wet dirt into soil, but limestone and black folks never grew in the same place. Today, my cousin just wants to lounge in the mud. He pulls his cat back and goes outside. But yeah, I guess I'll I'll open it up to questions. They might have any questions about the poems or poetry in general. Um, I guess I'll start
That's
with
awesome.
that.
Yeah, feel free to unmute your mics and ask your questions. I went through everybody's questions they posted online, and there's some phenomenal questions. So I hope we get around to them all.
Yes.
Sorry. So just like a general question about poetry in general, like what's your process in terms of like finding out what you want to write, or like finding like something that inspires you and then like trying to channel that into something that like becomes more tangible, like a poem.
Usually it finds me. I don't really have to go, most times I don't really go looking for it. I usually stumble across stories. I'm really interested in storytelling and reimagining stories, like I said before, and reconstructing stories. Um, and so usually they find me, I'm not really looking for it, and then I'll sit with it a couple of days. I don't really write, off the bat when I get, inspiration. I really sit with it a couple of days, think about it, process it, and then I'll finally sit down to write after like a couple of weeks or so. And I'll sit down and it depends on what I'm trying to go for. Like I'm a very, like, I guess I'm considered a very traditional formal poet, even though I do write sometimes in free verse. That last poem, of course, Mud, is in free verse. Usually, if I'm doing free verse poem, I write it in like prose first. I write it in just like regular sentences, and then I break it up later by the line or where I want to sort of cut the line breaks. If I'm doing a poem in form, I usually stick to the form. I've been working with sonnets lately. I've been writing sonnets lately. Um, so like I've been trying to like write a sonnet, like I was trying to write a sonnet a week. It's not working out that way. So I'm taking breaks in between. So I take a little bit of breaks, especially since the school back started and I've been teaching. So I've been on a little bit of hiatus from my sonnet making. But usually I'll go by, I usually try to like stay within the constraints of the sonnet, like the 14 lines and the iambic pentameter, and counting the syllables. So if it's formal, I try to stick with the form, but if it's free verse, I usually write it in a paragraph and then I'll break the poem up later, however I want to break it up.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Jabar. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you. So I had two questions actually, but they're a little deeper than just writing. Okay, so my first question was like, was there like a single event that like fueled you like wanting to write like Black? Like it's one thing to write, but to write Black and to like step out of the comfort zone of any like I guess the norm of poetry that we see nowadays. Like what like pushed you into that?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to start with this. Okay, so Terrence Hayes has a great poem in his recent book. If you haven't read, Terrence Hayes is a great poet too. He has a book of sonnets as well. That's what sort of inspired me to start my little sonnet making as well. But he has a great poem talking about Black artists and how we talk about, well, we all sort of gravitate towards writing Black-centered stories, but that's not necessarily where we started. And how like, Black poets will tell you their favorite Black, artists that they, inspired them. But really, if we're telling the truth, what inspired us to start writing were probably white artists, and that's just true for most people. Like your first, when you're in school, the first thing that, of course, we live in a very sort of Eurocentric, society. So the first thing you read are probably, white people's works. You don't really read Black people's works. Even in higher education is not really taught a lot. So I remember I was a kid, I was reading a lot of fantasy fiction, a lot of Harry Potter, a lot of like Percy Jackson, a lot of like adventure books, like spy books and stuff like that. These are all very, you know, and so that really like, I guess sort of formed my imagination at first. Then of course I have a very interesting family. They were all, my mom was always like, I think you should read more black centered stuff. And she was always trying to like push it into, you know, I have a very black, like Afrocentric family. So they're like, you know, you should start reading this. They were always giving me stuff to read as well. That was more like centered within, you know, my own culture. And so I guess when I got older, I sort of put down the fantasy and wanted to like, as I started to like know more like about what social was going on in the world, that also sort of made me want to sort of write more and center myself in my writing, because you just don't see it a lot. It's not mainstream. Usually black stories are not mainstream. And so that's what really, like, it was later on, like maybe towards like the beginning of like when I first got into college. I was thinking about like how I was going to a lot of classes, English classes, and they just weren't, you know, you go to American Lit and there's no black writers being taught in American literature. I'm just like, okay. So that sort of also pushed me like wanting more. So the fact that as I moved more deeper into education and I saw myself less and less, like I wanted to sort of write more and center myself, and center my people in, you know, my work versus like versus writing like fantasy fiction, which I started out writing when I was young. I would do little stuff like write fantasy fiction, tales and adventures, but I would also put black people in that as well. But it wasn't like based in like more reality stuff, like, you know, social issues and social justice things, and racism. I didn't really deal with that until later on. So I think if that answers your question, that was a very long-winded answer.
Lise, you also had a great second question. Do you mind posing that one too?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't mind. I don't mind. Okay. So you were speaking about like social issues, and one that I've like been particularly like interested in is toxic masculinity. And my question was, how like do you discipline yourself in your writing to be vulnerable as a male, as a black male, and you know, being okay to express yourself? Because now if a black male try to express himself, he's either coming off too strong or he's like being soft or sensitive. Oh, he muted. He's muted.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I actually deal with that a lot in the book as well. So the way that I deal with it, so I have a couple poems in here. I have some about my grandfathers. One about how, so a common thing I think that happens in a lot of black families, or in like in black family history. What I've come across and witnessed a lot is we have sort of the same kind of stories, especially about the black grandfathers as well, that they were abusive to our grandmothers. That is one thing that I deal with in this book, and dealing with that history of the fact that my grandfathers were abusive to their partners and spouses. Because I think I didn't really know my grandfather. They died before I was ever born, so I got to know my grandmothers. I didn't really get to know them. And so it's exploring that, you know, we don't, and it's also funny because nobody talks about them in my family. Nobody really mentions them ever because of the sort of like tainted past of them. I muted again, my bad. Okay, back to what I was saying though. I deal with that a lot in this book, because nobody really deals with that in my family or talks about them, because it's like a tainted past. They feel like, you know, you have to respect the dead. You can't really talk about that, or talk about those issues. And I really dive into that in the book. I also dive into, I don't know if anybody heard of Stephon Clark, or what happened to him. Stephon Clark, I forget what city he was in, but it essentially was another police brutality case where he got shot I think it was in his backyard. I think he was taking a phone call or something. It was wrong house. So like Breonna Taylor, they were at the wrong place, wrong time, and they ended up shooting him and killing him. But one thing that came out about Stephon Clark is that he made this very nasty, colorist comment about Black women, and so I talk about that as well in this book, and about the lack of vulnerability. I talk about that with Stephon Clark and my grandfather's lack of vulnerability, the lack of space to be vulnerable, for them to deal with their issues. My grandfather, he was abused as a child by his father. So it wasn't, it's not a coincidence that he grew up to abuse, his, wife and also children. And he didn't really deal with it. The best way he knew how to deal with it was drinking. That's just how you cope with things back then, because there was no therapist. You don't have money for therapy, and therapy is also stigmatized in Black communities as well as being weak. You're supposed to go to church and pray. You're not supposed to go seek help. So his father was. I think one of the stories I actually heard was that my mother finally told me about him is that his father, I don't know if he had mental issues or something like that, but he would I think he would hear things. He would hear things, and so he would grab his gun and he would start, waving it around his house, at his children and at his wife. So it was a very abusive household. He grew, of course, that means my grandfather grew up with, that is a very traumatic experience to grow up in a household like that. And then he, of course, grew up to abuse my grandmother. He was a drunkard as well. He was sort of like the town drunkard as well, falling in ditches and always getting drunk. So I deal with that in this book, the pain, also the abuse. I tried to not, I wanted this book, Whatever Happened to Black Boys, to be honest. I didn't want it to be just like, oh, we're all great and, we have no issues and it's all, we're beautiful and all this other stuff. I did want it to be honest as possible. That is not, it just sort of paints a human experience and not so much like a stigmatization, whether, because you either get one or two things. You get people trying to like make people heroes. I'm not really interested in that. Make people heroes, make people saviors, make them larger than life. Then you have the other side where people are trying to make people villains and villainous and just evil and downright monstrous and almost like they're beast-like. Black men, have they have the two things going on there. People trying to uplift them, but at the same time, people also trying to make them monstrous and aggressive. And I just wanted to sort of show a human experience, like, he was a person, he had issues, but he was also did some terrible things. And that is, that is just a part of it. But yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. That really helped. I have. Oh, can I share?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Okay. So yeah, you're talking about just like the real, like the raw experiences of a young Black boy. You would remind me so much of like the men in my family where there's an underlying issue, but it's kind of taboo to be talked about. Whether it's like with the elders of the family or just speaking out in general. But thank you for that. I'm gonna share your book with them.
There were some other great questions. Does anyone, Mallory, did you want to ask one of your questions?
Yeah, so one of my questions was, with everything going on in 2020, with all these like unprecedented times that we're going through, how has your poetry and creativity allowed you to express yourself and help you through these times?
So yeah, I started, I guess I'm going back to the sonnets. I started my sonnets back when the thing came out about Ahmaud Arbery. My goal was to write a sort of, I guess the title of the poems, or the title of the poems was going to be like, I forget this title. I haven't looked at it in so long. My bad. But it was supposed to be sort of me, sort of dealing with that and having to see that all the time. I don't really usually deal with police brutality cases too much. I don't want to talk about that because the videos are very traumatic for me. Um, so I usually stray away from them. But I decided to actually, my bad, I'm switching the ears. I actually decided to go ahead and deal with it in these sonnets, in these series of sonnets. And I started with Ahmaud Arbery, and then of course the George Floyd happened, and Breonna Taylor happened, and then Elijah McClain happened, and then everything started happening. So I guess the sonnets were like a way for me to get through it in a way. Like I just focused on that and like writing about it. And sort of, I treated them like therapy sessions, those sonnets. Hopefully they'll be published soon or something, or they'll be finished soon as well because I'm still working on them. But they were really like therapy sessions for me to get through this sort of past, summer, and well, back in like, starting with spring and then going into summer, all this stuff happening. But yeah, that's how I guess I dealt with it. And so it really didn't, I know I've heard a lot of people say like it's kind of this moment has sort of stifled their creativity. I think because they have a lot of stuff on their mind. I've heard a lot from a lot of other friends and stuff, like it's really hard to write. It's really hard to like create and be creative in this moment. And I completely understand that as well. But for me, it's just been a little bit different. I guess I moved toward it to sort of cope. Yeah.
Did you want to follow up to that at all, Mallory, or?
Let me move my camera.
With like the sorry, I'm pulling up my questions now. With your like sonnet series and like your poetry and whatnot, have you tried like any other forms of like literature or like expressivity that has been like really helpful for you?
You saying what forms?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think sonnet is one. I also started writing sestinas as well. I started writing sestinas. They're really hard. I started writing these sort of choose your own adventure sestinas that sort of deal with they sort of tell these very long-winded stories of just experiences I've had or experience, really other people's experiences, because I'm into other people's stories, not my own usually. But yeah, though writing in sonnets, writing in sestinas, I've written in villanelles before. I'm a really formal. I don't know why I gravitate towards form. I've been told it's possibly because I've always been into music, and so forms, those traditional forms usually mimic this, the way music moves. So I think that's maybe why I'm attracted to forms so much and those traditional forms. But yeah, I enjoy writing in forms. It's also a challenge to me, like to be able to like constraint. I always feel like it's like a challenge. Okay, how can I make this thing good and also make it me? Because these forms are not really traditionally supposed to be or made for Black people. So I guess it's like I see it as like a challenge. Like I can get this to work for me and for the story I'm trying to tell. If that answers your question, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to read them. I didn't want to put anyone on the spot, but Kaneda had some amazing questions. I was hoping maybe you'd want to ask one or two of those.
Okay. The first question that I guess I'll ask is there like one ideal from your book that you could go back and like apply that to your childhood, like as a Black boy, in a way? So like, what would that be, and I guess why?
Oh, is there I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit on my side of the screen.
I'll just say it again. Is there one ideal from your book that you could go back and apply to your own childhood, like as a Black male, and like what would that be and why?
from my childhood that I would retell or that I would tell. I guess I have a book. I have a story in here that's about me. It's about, well, it's actually about me watching cartoons. Uh, it's about, but I make it a little bit deeper than that. It was about like one of the only first like black superheroes I saw was Static Shock. So I know a lot of people are saying like Black Panther. You know, rest in peace to Chadwick Boseman. He was a lot for a lot of Black children. For me, it was Static Shock and seeing that on the WB. And so I wrote about that in this. Well, I wrote about that in this book, seeing him and what it meant to me to see myself there, and also like pretend and be sort of Static Shock as a child, and you know, sort of see myself through him through that lens. Because I do think that, you know, media has limitations, of course, in terms of like creating change or like creating substantive change. But I think it is positive to sort of see yourself and that affirmation within yourself on screen and in, you know, literature and in books and poetry and, you know, on TV and stuff like that. So I talk about that and what it meant to me. And how like I was in my own little world on those like Saturday mornings watching the WB, because we didn't really have cable, so that was one of the only channels that we got that actually played cartoons. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Do you mind asking your second question too? I really love it.
Yeah, let me just pull it up real quick. Oh, so to get, I guess, away from the actual writing aspect of your book, because like there's so much more to a book than just the literal, like, you know, writing. I was wondering, like, what was the inspiration behind the front cover of your book? Like, I noticed that the style was kind of like foggy and it looked like it was kind of dripping. And I was wondering if there was like a specific meaning or a reason as to why you chose that style for the front cover.
So actually, most artists, most poets, when you get to the book, the publishing part of it, you don't really get to choose the cover. You get a little bit of input, but you don't really get to choose it. I got a little bit of input in what I wanted to be my cover. I had originally wanted I was like, if you could get this person, this is probably impossible. But if you can get this person to like give this photo, that would be great. Instead, you know, they came back, they sort of took my ideas, because I was like, I wanted, you know, I sort of wanted it to be a face. I wanted it to be a face of a Black boy, or, you know, and I wanted to be sort of physical, and like the physical body. And so they couldn't give me the artist that I wanted, but they went and found another artist, on another Black artist online, and he actually deals with like the Black faces. Like he likes to, you know, draw and like paint in paint portraits of Black faces and also distort them. And so that, I guess what the editors were thinking was, is that the sort of pay less attention to like the eyes and more to the mouth, if you notice in that photo, because it is poetry supposed to be spoken. Also, this idea of whatever happened to Black boys, almost if it's been whited out in a sense, they thought was interesting. And so even though like we corresponded for a little bit on it, so even though I didn't get to necessarily choose, you know, the artist, they still gave me, they still corresponded with me and gave me great ideas, and we corresponded back and forth, also with the artist as well, and like came up with, I think, I like it. I turned out to like the photo, even though I didn't necessarily get the photo that, you know, I might have wanted. But I still like, I think this photo actually works better, in my honest opinion. But yeah.
Would you mind sharing the name of the artist with me?
Oh yeah, Irvin Johnson. He's on Instagram.
Awesome. Because their first essay is a visual rhetorical analysis of any object or artifact. So maybe they'll be inspired by some of his works.
Yeah, I actually think he just had like he just had his art exposed somewhere in like some type of gallery or something. So that was really cool to see as well. And his paintings and his portraits are really like, they're really haunting, which is also another thing I liked about this photo as well, that it wasn't like trying to be majestic, or wasn't trying to be, you know, but it was like very haunting. And that sort of like I don't know, I like dark, I gravitate more towards dark things. So I like the haunting aspect that he put in this portrait.
Yeah, I thought it was a really powerful cover as well, and I can't wait to read the collection because I'm sure it complements it. Okay, does anybody else have a question they want to ask? It could be anything that they came up with in advance, or something that you just came up with from our conversation. I know Isaac had a great question, if maybe he wanted to share.
Hold on one second, I'm pulling it up. Yeah, so basically I was just wondering what influence and kind of thought that you put towards in representing Black males throughout history. And basically, was there something in your past that kind of inspired you to start writing that like kind of as your main theme?
Yeah, so it was from that larger book, The Kissing Case, that inspired me. I had sort of stumbled across it. I had stumbled across an article. I'm always kind of reading like little things here and there. And so I stumbled across like this NPR article on it. And it was very short. It didn't give me very much detail about what had happened, except for the, you know, basic details. They got arrested as kids, and then they, I guess, you know, there was a movement to get them out. This all happened in like, I don't know if anybody knows where Monroe, North Carolina is, but it's like a little outside of Charlotte. And so there wasn't really much about it. There wasn't really much about like what happened to them or what happened after. And so I was really interested in like, okay, is nobody going to tell this story? Is nobody going to like get too deep, or is nobody going to like, you know, really get into like the crux of what happened to this family and how this changed their lives forever? And so that really inspired me to sort of start writing that. As I was doing that, a lot of other stories were coming to me. So stories that I was learning about my grandfathers, stories, of course, that were happening every day on the news were coming to me about other Black boys. And I always felt like people were only hitting the surface. Honestly, I was like, we're only hitting the surface here. We're not even really getting into the deep emotional stuff about what's going on here. And that really bothered me. And so I guess that's why I started writing about a lot of these different black male stories. There's also one story that happened in Chicago. There was a Black male activist that, you know, there was a string of Black activists, just period, that were committing suicide, and nobody's really talking about it. And there was this one story, the one activist got on live, and he had a gun to his head, essentially, and he was talking about how he was going to commit suicide. And I followed up on his story, and I was reading, so one of his friends is actually a journalist. And so I guess that's how his story got told, essentially, is because his friend was a journalist. And so his friend published his story and went into detail about, you know, what he was going through and what he went through, and how sort of getting into activism sort of messed him up mentally. Just the, you know, you don't really get many gains from, you know, activism is a very tough, you don't get paid for it. You don't get paid to do it. There really isn't a lot of good days. You don't win a lot of fights. It's a lot of failures and a lot of people being mad at you because you're not, you know, getting change done the way, you know, and the speed and time that they want you to get it done. And then you also have to deal with, you know, political stuff and all that. So like the being pushed and pulled from both directions of his community, and also of dealing with the politics of in Chicago as well, because the Chicago politics, if you ever read anything about Chicago politics, is just very seedy and dirty. But so dealing with that really messed up his mental, also having to deal with his own sexuality, and having to hide a part of himself from his family and from his community as well. He felt like he had to do that. So like that messed up, and I write about that. And that's actually, that poem is in this book as well. Whatever happened to Black boys. So I was getting a lot of different stories at a certain time, and I was just like, let's get a little deeper here with what we've been given, because they only, the news articles, they're like I said, historians, they just record what they know as factual, but they don't really get into the emotional stuff. So I guess that's what really propelled me to write about these people. Yeah.
So do you see your poetry as an act of activism?
Yeah, I mean, I think poetry is an act of activism. It walks a line. I always say, like, I don't know how much art changes things or makes people aware, but I don't know. I still feel compelled to do it. I still feel compelled to do it, even if I know there's not going to be probably not going to be like Black artists have come before me, Black artists will be after me. People have been doing this for a very long time. So I don't know how much Black art changes anything, but I think it's important, and I still feel compelled to do the work, even though it might not get me any gains. I think that's also with activism as well. You might do the work for years and years and years, but you might not get any gains in it. The civil rights movement was going on for years and years and years before like they ever started. The 60s came around and they actually started to get traction. So, it's just you feel compared to be in the fight. I guess the best way to put it. You still compelled to, like, that is my resistance. That is my sort of rebellion. Even though it might not come of anything, I put in my work. I'm putting in my work. I'm putting in my work right now. At least that's all I can do is put in the work and do the work.
Well, I, for one, definitely appreciate it, and keep fighting the good fight, because it is so important, right, everybody? We want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today and to share so much about your activism, your art, and your personal life, right? Because that's what it's all about. So thank you very much, Jabar, for taking the time to speak with us. Would you mind if I shared like your email with students who might want to speak with you further about anything today? Okay, awesome. So I'll share that with anybody who's looking to further the conversation with Jabar. But it seems like we have run out of time for this session. It was great. I want to thank everybody for, I'm just like invigorated with all the conversation that we had today, and it's going to take me a few days to process everything. And I'm excited about that. It's that lingering thoughts after these like deep conversations. Like that's what it's all about. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Be safe and enjoy your extra day. Remember why we have a Labor Day. All right. And Jabar, I'll see you again soon in a few minutes.
All right. Thank you guys for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.